Well, Australian Steve Keen was apparently one of only a handful of economists to predict the global financial crisis. His most recent book is called Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And in it, he talks about how rising levels of private debt make another financial crisis almost inevitable unless politicians tackle the real dynamics causing financial instability. And this morning, he has words for New Zealand also. Spoiler alert, the Professor of Economics at the UK's Kingston University is far from optimistic.
We're focusing on entirely the wrong topic. This is the bizarre thing. You look around the world, there's all this fetish and fixation on the level of government debt. What actually caused the crisis was runaway private debt. And at the same time, we could do something about it if we acknowledge the nature of money. But we have this mythical view that money is something like gold and it's hoarded and we can all save it at the one time. And you should always repay your debts because we know banks are always responsible lenders. And all these myths get in the way that mean that even though it would be feasible to avoid having a crisis, we're likely to have one, very likely, for a large number of countries. And when that happens, they'll join other countries that had a crisis back in 2008 and Japan in 1990, and we'll all be encumbered with ludicrous levels of private debt that shouldn't be there and could be easily eradicated, but won't be.
And later in the interview, we'll talk about some of those countries. You spell them out quite specifically, including a message for New Zealand. But Steve, you say in the book that the global economy has been saddled with a level of private debt that is not only unprecedented since the Second World War, but unprecedented in the history of capitalism.
Yeah, there's only two countries I can really take the data that far back to make that claim, but they happen to be the United States and United Kingdom. So both of them have got data series which go back in the UK's case to 1880 and America's case. They have to take together a few different time series to do it. You can get a data series for private debt going back to 1834 and looking at that and making it so that the data, which they've got drastically different sources they're dragging the data from. And then talking about the United States Census on the one hand and the Federal Reserve on the other. But they overlap sufficiently. You can use the overlaps to say, okay, let's make the levels from previous dates consistent with the current levels. And you look at it, and there is no, and again, as you've said, it's the highest level as a percentage of GDP after you've done those calculations in 180 years.
In the book here, you talk quite a bit. In fact, you base a lot of your thinking on a maverick American economist called Hyman Minsky, quite central to your thinking. And this economist his ultimate conclusion was that crises in pure market capitalism was inevitable. So tell us about this economist, because he was sort of marginalised, but his thinking is actually really very current, as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are beginning to realise after a decade after the financial crisis that it ain't exactly as scientific as it would like to pretend to be. And if you take a look at what dominated economics from about the 1960s, 70s on, was this fetish of trying to derive macroeconomic theory, which is theory of the entire economy, from microeconomic theory, which is theory of isolated individuals, both consumers and firms. And that was really like a navel-gazing exercise that consumed the profession. And Minsky had nothing of it. His fundamental question that he tried to solve in his research was, what caused the Great Depression, and is another one likely? And of course, I've carried on doing that work, doing what Minsky didn't manage to do, which is producing mathematical models of it, and that's what gave me forewarning of the crisis.
And to the point he was marginalised, you make the point that even great economists like Ben Bernanke, who did a major book on the Great Depression, pretty much bypassed Hyman Minsky's viewpoint. In fact, just included as a bit of a footnote.
Even the footnote was almost an insult. I mean, the crazy thing, this guy, Bernanke, got the job as Federal Reserve President on the basis that he was the expert on the Great Depression. And anybody outside economics would think, well, the expert, he would have looked at the data extensively, considered every possible cause, and looked at all the various arguments, certainly maybe not from cranks, but people who were acknowledged not to be cranks. And in this book, which is about 250 pages long, there are 48 words devoted to Minsky. And those 48 words say that Hyman Minsky and Kindleberger, who's a person influenced by Minsky, have on occasions argued for the instability of the economic system, but have had to deviate from the assumption of rational behavior. And then he says in the footnote, I don't doubt the importance of irrationality in ordinary life, but I think the best research postulate is to push the rationality idea as far as it will go. End of story. And this is the level of dismissal that the mainstream has of anything which is alternative thought.
So let me get this right. So, Steve, to accept current levels, current views, or mainstream economic views of how economics works, is it true that you kind of have to buy into underlying assumptions about human behaviour?
Yeah. If you hear a textbook rendition of these assumptions, they might sound reasonable to some degree. So, like, for example, let's assume people are rational. Well, that sounds pretty sensible, I mean, we don't actively go against our own interests all the time. But if you look in the fine print and see how do they define rational? Well, the definition of rational is you have a model which, on average, accurately predicts the future. Now, that means there have been two rational people on the planet. One's Nostradamus, the other, if you're in religion, is whoever you think is God. And yet that is what they use as a code word for rational behavior. So you have to look really, really deeply into the literature to actually understand where the hell they're coming from. You can't rely upon textbooks, and you certainly can't rely upon newspaper summaries unless the journalist himself has turned into a critic by seeing this stuff. So they get away with blue murder. And I knew that there was no chance of pointing out to the public how wrong they were until after they helped cause a financial crisis, because a bit like if you're driving a car, unless you're a mechanic, you don't really care how the engine operates. You only worry about it when the car breaks down between cities.
Tell us a little bit about the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. And you argue that neoclassical economists have assumed that what's true on a micro or individual level is true on the macro or economy-wide level, and that's fundamentally wrong. We often hear politicians compare the economy to a household budget. Steve, what's wrong with that approach?
It's simple to illustrate. It's very easy to fall into that thinking, if I can do it, the government can do it type thinking. And you see that happening all the time. But what they've done is say whatever happens at the level of an isolated individual, we can extrapolate that to the entire economy. So students, for example, when they go through a mainstream economics course at some stage, it used to be in first year when I studied. These days they copy it in third year. It's supposed to be too hard for undergraduate students these days. But they show you how to derive an individual demand curve from the constraints an individual faces, which is their budget, and the preferences they have, which they describe using smooth curves showing substitutability between one product and another in terms of giving you the consumer satisfaction. And then they jump over scaling up from the individual to the collective. And they actually, a bunch of mathematical economists, and give them their credit here, they posed the question, is it valid to do that? And they concluded that it wasn't. But they concluded in such a way that if students can read this stuff and not realize how silly it is. What they're really doing is saying you take an isolated person and scale up to the whole society.
Yeah.
If you did the same thing with fluids, you would say, okay, I can describe the behavior of a molecule of water, H2O, pardon me, and then I can scale that up to describing a large mass of it, which would mean that you have to, under a certain temperature, a molecule would turn from a water molecule into a steam molecule, and go in the opposite direction would turn into an ice molecule, and then my personal favorite, under certain conditions, you could turn it into a snowflake molecule. Now, that's total nonsense. The actual behavior of H2O depends upon how each identical molecule interacts with other molecules given the temperature that it's surrounded by. So in other words, you can't even describe a glass of water without talking about the relationships between these entities. And what they do in economics is say, take an isolated model of a firm, scale it up to a supply curve. Take an isolated consumer, scale it up to the market. It's simply mathematically invalid. But they do it because it reaches the conclusions they wish to reach.
So again, like that idea of rational behaviour amongst consumers, it's less fact or statistics than philosophy.
Yeah, and this is the trouble, because when you look where the philosophy came from, it was largely a reaction to what Marx had done with the previous economic philosophy, which we called classical economics. And in the hands of Smith and Ricardo, this was used as a way of attacking the remnants of the feudal system and championing the capitalists. But Marx took it, twisted it in various ways, of course, and turned into a critique of capitalism and an argument for socialism. So in the mid-1870s, economists who are much more market-oriented than Marx, obviously, worked on an alternative philosophical foundation that goes back to a guy called Jean-Baptiste Say, and they reworked it to say, well, capitalism is really about maximizing people's satisfaction. And they built a whole set of models of this, basically the supply and demand stuff we still have today. But to make it possible to analyze using the tools of the 19th century, they made a few of what we call simplifying assumptions. And one of those simplifying assumptions was that nothing happens out of equilibrium.
Right.
That's really helpful. Another was that banks, debt, and money don't exist. Now, you would think that later economists would say, well, let's bring in the fact that things do happen out of equilibrium, and let's bring in the fact that banks do actually exist and have a major impact on the economy. But they didn't. They stuck with those same initial assumptions and stuck with modeling an equilibrium when about 70 years ago, it's getting pretty close to a century ago, but say 70 years ago, engineers worked out how to model non-equilibrium systems. And this has become commonplace in engineering. It's commonplace in some parts of management as well. And it hasn't even penetrated the brains of economists, mainstream economists, that this is possible. They've ossified this 19th century reaction to Marx and turned it into the basis of modern economics. It looks extremely complicated. It's very complicated mathematics, but the underlying concepts are still those of the 19th century.
And here we are, and hence, because of these under certain assumptions, it is very, very hard to predict future cycles. But I'm talking with Steve Keen, the book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? Steve Keen correctly predicted the global financial crisis. And there's a very interesting quote related to all this, and that is what Hyman Minsky said, that it's quite classic: stability is destabilizing. So a period of tranquil growth will lead to rising expectations and a tendency to increase leverage. Have I got that right?
Yeah, and it's very, again, Minsky said himself with a realistic question saying, what caused the Great Depression and can it happen again?
Yeah.
And so he said, okay, can I get an explanation for that? And what he ended up writing was much, much more real world than anything you'll ever find in a mainstream economic textbook. And if people are curious of reading the original, I highly recommend getting a book of readings by Minsky called Can It Happen Again? And that's how he actually phrased it when he was starting doing this work. He said, can it, a Great Depression, happen again? And if it can happen again, why hasn't it happened in the time between 1945 and when he was writing, which was 1982? And that's a very realistic, grounded orientation for developing your economics. And as part of that, he said, well, we live in a cyclical economy and we live in historical time. And therefore, if you take some point in time leading up to Alan Bond time, if you like, the early 1980s, there'd been a financial crisis in the recent past. That meant that both borrowers and lenders, being banks, were very conservative about the projects they fund. Because they were conservative, most of those projects succeeded. Because they succeeded, people who didn't gamble with the leverage thought, oh, we made a mistake. We should have borrowed more money. We'd made a larger gain. And then what happens, the further you move away from that previous crisis, the more optimistic you get, and you finally get to a stage of what Minsky calls euphoric expectations. And at that stage, both borrowers and banks are quite willing to lever up dramatically. They'll finance anything because people think that everything's going to work. And you get a boom driven, which of course means you get bad projects being funded. And you also, by causing a boom, you change the distribution of income because suddenly there's a shortage of workers, so wages get bid up. You're competing to get raw materials, so those prices go up. You don't quite get the profit expectations you thought you'd get, and therefore you stop investing and you fall back into a slump again. Beautiful, simple explanation of where the cycle comes from, but he added the fact that when that happened, because you borrowed during a boom but had to repay debt during a slump, you'd end up with a high level of debt when the next cycle began, and the next and the next and the next, until you hit what was ultimately called a Minsky moment, when there's so much debt taken on that the downturn period simply didn't enable you to get back into balance again. The debt would continue compounding. You'd end up in a Great Depression.
Wow. Just on a personal anecdote, listening to this, Steve, I can always recall, this is in New Zealand, back in, before the global financial crisis, so early 2007, and I was on a bus and I saw this massive billboard. And I was looking around, to buy a little apartment or something at the time. Had some savings, but there was a big billboard, and it was an advertisement for a bank, and it said, "No more weird flatmates, 100% home loans." And I've always Remember that. Never forgotten it. And I thought to myself, how can that be? How can I call a bank and they can give me 100% deposit? And I thought that was extraordinary. I thought then, how sustainable is that?
And you're right, it was not unsustainable. And this is the other part of the logic, which I cover in the book, as you're aware as well, that banks create money by lending. And people think they lend money. I've actually thought of a new term after I wrote the book. Rather than saying banks lend, if you and I, if you wanted to buy, I wanted to buy some jewelry, some New Zealand jewelry off, and you lent me the money to buy it, then that is actual lending. You've got to put aside money you've saved to give it to me, and I then buy it. You can't spend it. Well, I've got the money. I've got to pay you back, and it's a bit like a seesaw. If you lend money to me, my spending power goes up, yours goes down, but overall the aggregate doesn't change. And that's the model that mainstream economists have of lending as well. So they ignore the financial sector on that basis. And if they were right, they'd be justified in ignoring it as well. But what banks actually do is they originate money and debt. So I'm calling that bank originated money and debt, or bombed. And when you get bombed in an economy, the banks are creating the money literally out of double entry bookkeeping, literally out of nothing. And when they do it, that gives them a claim on real resources. So they're quite happy when the bubble's going on to provide that 100% finance. I've even seen loans for 120%.
Wow.
And because they end up owning assets by double entry bookkeeping.
My goodness. None of this is going to be reassuring to the local audience here, to the New Zealand audience.
Particularly to Don Brash, I might add, because I saw his being in newspapers deriding people who are talking about banks originating money. And he's dead wrong. This is one of these classic things. Even central bank governors don't understand, some of them, how money and banks operate. Thankfully, some of them are waking up to it, and that includes the Bundesbank of all things, which quite flatly contradicts Don Brash on this particular point.
And interestingly, we'll talk about Germany very soon, but back to New Zealand, where private debt here is at record levels, and we've got a real issue with inequality barely being kept in check, despite large transfers through the tax system. You mention New Zealand as one of the countries you term debt zombies, and it's included in your list of the walking dead. Should New Zealand be worried?
Yeah, New Zealand's in a strange situation, in fact, because I divided the world into two major groups. There's what I call the walking dead of debt. It had already had a financial crisis, and is in the aftermath they'd have really subdued credit demand, and the housing bubbles they had have burst, though some of them have restarted again, like the American one. But others I'd call zombies to be, because they avoided the crisis by borrowing their way through it, and now set up with a larger level of debt, so they're going to have a bigger crisis in the next, in my opinion, 1 to 3 years. New Zealand sort of fits in both camps. That's what I might call Schrodinger's zombie, both undead and undead, because you had a peak level of private debt, according to BIS figures, of about 190% of GDP back in 2009, and then you de-levered to some extent, but now you bottomed out at about 170%. Now you levered your way back up to about 180% of GDP, and most of that's in the household sector. So that's driven the housing bubble in New Zealand, which of course the authorities normally deny, but it's clearly there, though it's actually, in my opinion, starting to turn right now. So you guys have had two bites at the zombie cherry.
So that housing bubble you talk about, Steve, in New Zealand is going to burst.
Yeah, you don't have the same supports that Australia has in terms of foreign buyers coming in there. Equally not as levered as Australia is. This is just to give you a comparison. The level of household debt, the GDP in New Zealand is about 95% of GDP. Australia, it's 120%. And there's been a much more significant bubble in Australia since the financial crisis than there is in New Zealand. So Aussies have been worse overall. But certainly, I think a bubble's going to burst.
Time frame?
In the next 1 to 2 years. There's been a real acceleration in house prices, as you know, since 2012. They've increased by about 60% from those levels. But what I'm seeing right now is that the motive force for rising house prices is rising mortgage credit. And now you've reached a peak in the rate of rising of that credit. It could be spiked again. The government can always come in and restart a bubble, and the Australians have done that incessantly since 1985. But in your case, the wind on that bubble is starting to run out and headed down. And I think that will probably be where you cease pushing up, because you're going to find a number of other countries in which you depend for exports are also going to be suffering from this. So partly what can save you, the external demand is not going to be there.
Now, you correctly forecast the GFC, the global financial crisis, but here's the weird thing. Australia at the time didn't go into recession. All we can recall is this massive mineral boom and importing all their raw materials to China. Tell us what happened there.
Two things. Firstly, and I think I've got a certain responsibility for this. I'll explain. The Australian government dived in with the biggest stimulus package in the OECD around the time of the Lehman Brothers collapse. And partly the reason for that is there's actually a timing story here. I was interviewed on the 7:30 report by Kerry O'Brien one day for half the show. And Kerry was exploring my thesis in great detail. The next day, he spent the entire show interviewing one Kevin Rudd. Had him in total panic mode and throwing in my comments all the way. 1 week later, the Australian government announced its stimulus package. That included giving $1,000 to everybody with a pulse in the country who paid their taxes. And I was in favour of that because I thought that was the sort of stimulus you have to give from the government. But the other policy move was to double and treble what they called the first-time owners grant, and I call the first-time vendors grant.
Yeah.
And when this Australian study, rather than giving $7,000 to a first-home buyer, which was the initial level of this thing, by the way, the first-time owners grant was there to enable the Australian economy to recover from the shock of introducing the GST. That was back in 2000. So 7 years later, we're still getting. Australians are very delicate creatures. New Zealanders are aware. So this thing was maintained till 2008, and then it was doubled for an existing house to 14,000, trebled to 21,000 for a new house. And Victoria kindly threw in an extra $14,000 for anybody buying a place outside Melbourne. So in that case, a non-Melbourne purchaser of a new property in Victoria was being given $35,000 by the government to go buy the house. So there's your 100% deposit, 100% of the bank in that sense, because the government gave you the complete deposit. And that restarted the housing bubble. So the first part of Australia that escaped from the financial crisis in terms of getting back to pre-financial crisis employment levels wasn't one of the mineral states that people normally think it is. It was Victoria. That ran out in about mid-2010. That's when the grant was ceased and house prices started coming off the boil at that stage, and the economy started to suffer the downturn. But by that stage, China had dived into its huge-scale stimulus because China, and people tend to forget this, when the financial crisis hit, because China's industry is so export-oriented, it had about a 40% fall in its exports volumes. And that meant a massive wave of migration from the coastal cities where the manufacturing occurred, with people who didn't have residency permits there but working in the factories, back to the countryside, terrifying the Communist Party that they'd have a political split in the country. And they basically told the private banks there, and often the state-owned banks as well, to lend to anybody with a pulse. And China's went from credit being a substantial but not overwhelming proportion of demand and running at about 100% of GDP to about 220% about 5 or 6 years later. Now, that huge credit-based stimulus in China sucked out minerals exports from Australia, from Canada, and so on, and gave both those countries a salve that got them well and truly through the financial crisis. So they boomed, in that stage. And I noticed that the Australian Federal Reserve, RBA, started describing the global financial crisis as the North Atlantic financial crisis.
Right. But, Steve, has it only delayed a financial crisis for Australia?
Yeah, this is the thing, because they've got out of the crisis in Australia's case by borrowing more money. I'm talking private debt here rather than government. I think the obsession on government debt is misplaced. I might explain if we get time. To give you an idea of what that meant for Australia, they hit about 190% of GDP as the private debt level when the crisis hit. They were flatlined at that level for a while and then started going down in 2010. But from 2012 to now, they rose from 180% of GDP to 205% of GDP. So that was additional demand from credit stimulating the economy when other economies were suffering from negative credit. But that's now reached a peak, and private debt is now falling in Australia. And as it falls, the demand from credit declines. And that's what actually sets off a crisis.
I'm with economist Steve Keen, a new book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And a little bit about China too, because again, in that debt zombie bracket, and you talk of countries with large private debt facing the junkies dilemma, you call it. Borrow more now, or go cold turkey, or continue shooting up on credit and experiencing a bigger bust later on. And China, you say, is the biggest debt junkie Of them all, what will happen, Steve, if China goes cold turkey, and what will happen if it goes bust?
Cold turkey would be, in China's case, credit demand is roughly equivalent now in China to 25% of China's GDP. Now, if that goes to simply zero, so the credit stops growing at all, then you're talking about effectively an economy one quarter the size of China disappearing from global commerce. And what happened in America's case was it went from 15% to -5%, so a 20% turnaround. If China did something of the same scale from where it's talking, you're about losing about economy about one third the size of China from global demand. So it's monstrous at that level. What China can do that other countries can't very easily is flip over instantly to government spending. And so I think they'll attenuate it to some degree, but it's still going to be a credit crunch will have to happen in China, and that means collapse in house prices, a collapse in demand, and all sorts of bankruptcies and things running through the system, which the Chinese will definitely not report honestly and try to paper over as well at the same time, but it'll be happening.
And that will have a big effect worldwide.
Yeah, because even if you adjust the figures for some of the exaggeration that goes on in their reporting, they are definitely the second biggest economy on the planet. They're about 2/3 the size of the American economy. And then credit demand is, as I said, about 25% of their equivalent to 25% additional on top of their GDP. So if that disappears, then a huge source of demand for commodities and also for financial instruments around the rest of the world evaporates. So it'll be a big bust, but at the same time, the Chinese look like they're already turning into government spending to try to make up the difference. So huge infrastructure projects and also building the Silk Road and a whole lot of foreign aid, which is really a ways of maintaining employment for Chinese workers, because when China does foreign aid, they don't only just send the money, they send the labor and they send the materials and the industry and end up owning the assets as well. So there are ways in which China will get out of this more easily than other countries can do.
Right. I want to just bring up something just off the side in your thinking in the book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? There is something interesting you said about economic management by leaders, saying that the peculiar dynamics of debt means that a politician who either triggers or benefits from a debt bubble is seen as a good economic manager, while the politician who wears the aftermath is accused of being incompetent. And you cite the case, in the American case, of Bill Clinton and George Bush. Can you explain that a bit for us?
Yeah, when you have a debt bubble going on, the debt bubble means that because demand consists of the turnover of existing money plus credit demand can be such a substantial component of demand when private debt is rising that unemployment can fall, so welfare payments drop, tax revenue rises, so the more money comes in for the government, and the government goes into surplus. And because we have this fetish in believing that government should run a surplus, that's taken as good economic management, when in fact what's going on, there's a financial bubble that's run riot in the country. And of course, we all know that Bill Clinton apart from having a dalliance with an intern at the White House, he also was the person who abolished the Glass-Steagall Act that basically let finance capital rip even more in America than it was doing previously. So he was seen as a good economic manager and making good, sensible decisions about the financial sector, which set off a bubble that burst in the hands of one George W. Bush, and which led to completely rapacious behaviour by the financial sector. So, but the main thing is, looking at his performance, he can boast that he ran a surplus. Well, the last American president who could boast that he ran a surplus was Hoover back in the 1920s. What happened afterwards? The Great Depression. So, then what happens is the person who then, when the credit slows down, the person who's in the chair when the credit slows down gets the blame for being a bad manager, which is what's hit George W. Bush. Now, I'm not going to say he's a good manager, but he wore the opprobrium for the bubble that Clinton was in the chair for when it started.
Tell me, are proponents of neoclassical economics, like the IMF, Steve, are they starting to change their thinking? Are they starting to come round a little bit to economists back in the day like Hyman Minsky?
To some extent, it certainly is happening more effectively in central banks and in treasuries and some international institutions than it's happening in academic departments, because academic departments are just, when anything goes wrong, they shut down and go back to micro and say it wasn't our fault and come back 30 or 40 years later with the same garbage in a more refined form. But the central banks, particularly the Bank of England, really wore the opprobrium from politicians about giving completely misleading advice about the economy to those politicians. So some of those institutions are really looking seriously at how they model and saying we've got to look at other approaches apart from the mainstream. In the IMF, I'm corresponding occasionally with Olivier Blanchard, who was the chief economist there, and he's one of a number of prominent ex-officials in government institutions who are saying we have to really change how we model the economy. We're not sure how, because they've been stuck in this world and thought it worked so well for the last 40 years. They've developed a whole way of thinking which is inappropriate for modelling capitalism, and they can't see any other way to go forward. So they're a bit all at sea, but they are admitting they've got something wrong and need to do something different.
Hey, just finally, Steve, if you were appointed New Zealand's finance minister, what would you start by doing?
Well, this is the thing. Because I've diagnosed the problem as being excessive private debt, I'd work out ways to get private debt down. And this, again, I know it'll sound outrageous when anybody hasn't looked at what my arguments come from, but we've got two money factories in any capitalist economy. One are the private banks, and they create money by creating debt. And the other is the government. It creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxes, which it's quite capable of doing because it owns its own bank. And we accept that bank's money as payment for anything we have to purchase. So the government can actually create money, and that can be used to cancel private debt. And a bit like the Rudd government's $1,000 to everybody who paid their taxes in Australia back in 2008, I'd be making a transfer to every private bank account, but on condition that those who were in debt had to pay their debt down, while there's those who weren't in debt got a cash injection, which you might channel to say they've got to buy shares with it, for example, rather than letting them buy goods and services with it if you wanted to control the inflationary impact. But something of that nature would effectively replace too much credit-based, debt-based money with more fiat-based money and enable you to get out of the accounting trap that you get into when the private sector has more debt than can repay. I'd also be watching the value of the currency. You've got to see what happens on that front. You've got to look at the impact on inflation, which, of course, at the moment central banks are trying to cause, so that wouldn't be too much of a problem if you cause some inflation as well. But that's a radical change from what conventional policy is, and I think
Never happen.
I'd be under attack from the press as well. Most of them, not having read my book, wouldn't know where the hell I was coming from.
Fascinating, really economist from Kingston University in the UK, Steve Keen. Can we avoid another financial crisis? He predicted the GFC. Steve, it's a pleasure having you on the show.
It was great fun. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Well, there you go. What do you think? The economist who predicted the GFC saying that the New Zealand housing bubble will burst in the next 1 to 2 years.